Hi everyone, and welcome to another Old World Behemoths hobby tutorial. Today I'm going to run you through the snow-based terrain effect that I've put together for my Knights of the White Wolf, which we're going to be seeing a little more of over the next few weeks. This is a really easy technique, provided that you have the right tools, and I'll show you those in just a second. It's really simple and straightforward, and actually reasonably quick in terms of what you can get done to get this sort of mixture of muddy ground and slushy snow and snowdrifts. It works really beautifully if you clump it up to make a drift, and it blends really simply. For example, what you can see here is this defined edge that I've put on this side of the model, like it's less melted snow, and then you can blend it around as well on any of the other strong edges to make it look like that little bit more melted and slushy. So I'll show you a couple of different ways that we can do this, ways that you can keep the effects of whatever you put underneath it as well. What you can see here is this little mud effect that's underneath here. So ways that you can preserve that, ways that you can build in terms of snow, and some of the ways that I've approached it and looked at it to get this really nice, really simple effect. So there are loads of tools that you can use to build snow and build snowy ground. I've used water effects and technical paints in the past to put muddy ground together. And then I've used the old baking soda, white paint, PVA glue technique to actually do snow. But recently I came across these wonderful tools that you can see on the screen. These are AK Terrain's acrylic diorama effects. There are a stack of these that are for all different terrain types, and I really recommend you go and check them out. There's one for a much more muddy ground that you can use in place of the wet ground effect as well, if this doesn't go quite far enough for you. But what I've experimented with fits the sort of vision that I had in mind for these snowy bases, and really only uses just these two tools. Like with any basing, you can start with whatever structure or color you want. What I've done for my base is to set up this darker base effect is use scale color black, and really any black is going to do. But I've gone ahead and hand based all of these. This isn't with a spray can, and there's a reason for that I'll get to in a second. But on top of these two, I've stuck a bit of PVA down and stuck some collections of stones. And what we'll do is we'll get the mud piled around that, and then we'll pop a bit of snow on top to give that a bit of a look of verticality in the bases before the horses go on. What you'll be able to see, or what you should be able to see as I tilt the bases, are that you'll see the brush strokes all the way down. And that's intentional because this wet ground effect is actually relatively sensitive if you're putting it on a thin layer over the tops of the bases. So with all of them, I've left some of those streaky marks, only because if you're considering what snowy fields look like or snowy pathways look like, there's not going to be that uniform smooth texture. And I don't want to leave the terrain paint purely to be doing all of the work. I'll get started by showing you how the wet ground actually goes onto the bases. So you'll see the sort of color that it has, the way that it can clump up and thin out for thinner textures. But first, I wanted to show you inside of the pot itself. It does look very much like a quite wet acrylic paint, but what you start to see is when you pop your brush in is that it looks very much like a lot of the other texture paints, maybe just a little bit looser. You can see it does clump up, and there is plenty of fine grained sort of dirt and mud through all of that as well. In terms of stages for how this effect will work, it's going to be the wet ground first. We'll leave that to fully dry. Then we'll stick the snow over the top. Once the snow's on, we'll do a little bit of blending and finishing, but fundamentally it really is just a two-step process. So let's get some paint on. I'm going to make this quite thick, this particular one. I'm not going to be shy about adding plenty of the acrylic effect here. People might not be terribly happy with me, but that's okay. I'm very willing to experiment with these bases and figure out what will work and what won't. What you need to do now, particularly when it's thick like this, is use your brush just to stipple it a little bit, maybe round out some of those big sharp muddy corners, but effectively that's it. So we've got our quite thick layer there. That's going to dry in this really beautiful glossy effect. So with this other base, I'll do it a little bit thinner, except for around the rocks where I want it to sort of pile and clump. I'm not fussed about getting it on the rocks as we sort of paint round, there is going to be the snow layer that goes over the top of this as well. So it's not like these rocks are suddenly going to look too consumed with mud once that goes on. It is, again, mostly about the verticality here. It's part of the reason why I haven't gone over these rocks with a standard color as well. I'm not necessarily looking for the colors of the stone. I'm more interested in the texture and the way that it will apply to the actual perception of verticality in the base. So I'm not going to go over the top of them right now. I might change my mind about that a little later, but we'll see whether we can keep any of those rock colors actually influencing the snow color that ends up going on top. So I'll tuck it in, clump it around the rocks, make it look like they're a little bit raised, but otherwise I do want to try and thin this out a little bit over the remaining sections. You've got to be careful when you do this not to leave really obvious brush strokes when you're going through, because it is quite easy as you thin this texture effect down. All I'm aiming for here is a sort of natural looking mud effect, maybe a few streaks. It is frozen mud after all, so it's not the biggest deal if it doesn't look totally organic. I think that looks pretty okay. The time it takes for them to dry is totally going to depend on the thickness of the texture paint. This one will probably be dry in 4 or 5 hours, and this one will be dry, except for maybe some of these thicker areas, probably in about 3. So I'm going to do these other bases, and we'll regroup when everything is dry to show you popping on the snow effect. It's been about 4.5 hours now since we painted our wet ground effect onto these bases, and now they're totally dry. Running my finger over it, there's no sticky or tackiness, just nice, dry, shiny, wet-looking earth. It's a really beautiful effect on its own. It's got this lovely gloss shine that you can see under my direct white overhead lighting. But when you get it set on a table and it catches the light in just the right way, it really can be very pretty. You'll see that it is a sort of dark greenish brown in terms of tint, just as a raw color. That's a decent reflection of what it sort of ends up looking under white light. It does get warmer, obviously, under yellow light or sunlight, but in general, that's what you're looking at. The two in the middle here are the two that we did on camera. This one is a thick layer of mud, and you can sort of see that there is those thicker clumps. It's more gluggy and condensed than this one, which is the lighter one that we did. You can see the much lighter textures through here, and while you've got the clumping around the rocks, it is thinner more generally across the base itself. Both are going to have their benefits when we go now to apply our snow effect. So let's do that. Goodbye wet ground and hello snow. I'll pop the raw product on, and then we'll be revisiting each base with a couple of applications of water to thin it down so we can get a mixture of slushy, icy, snowy effects. These ones I'm going to be trying for the first time, so I'll do one of those with you and get a best guess of what it looks like, and then I might do this bad boy to really get a thin layer of the snow effect on top for really wet ice and snow. As before, what I'm going to do is give you a look inside the snow terrain effect itself. This is a bit different to the wet ground effect in that what you've got in here is quite thick. You can see my brush strokes against the seal lid on the inside where I've scraped it away and the form has been preserved. If we go in here with a brush though, it's very solid acrylic product. It's quite different in terms of how we want to apply it. And while there's a couple of different approaches, you can sort of stack it as you want for really tall drifts, or you can be quite sparing with it. We'll sort of look at what you want to do based on your theme. For the purposes of this one, where I'm going really slushy, what I'm going to do is just put a couple of dollops down, make them asymmetrical, but that'll be really effectively enough for me to make sure that I can spread that all over the base with a bit of thinning and make it look really lovely and wet. I'll pop that down and come over here for a minute. Another good thing about this, by the way, is that you can apply it and then come back to thin it, because it does take a little while to dry. What I'll do over here is look at maybe doing a little bit of a snow drift in between some of these rocks. Really make the most of, as I sort of pointed out, the verticality of these stones. It might look like I'm putting a bit much on in terms of the product, but what you'll see when we thin it down, or what I'm hoping to see, is a really good effect of that snow running off the top of these. So we'll grab a touch more, just a little bit more on the top. We'll really see how that goes in terms of thinning it down. All you need now is a little bit of water, and you're there. Grab some clean water, just apply it to the brush, the same brush that I was using before, and then just directly over the top. Muddle it, melt it, apply it very much as though you're trying to clean it off. And what you want is to see that liquid running down. The thinness of this is obviously going to be totally determined by how much water you use, but the really good news is that as it actually starts melting down and thinning, trying to avoid getting too many bubbles in there. But yeah, as you melt it down and thin it, the thinner it gets, the more natural the application actually starts to look. I think that's probably about enough for there. Again, we'll grab some more water here, just over the top, thin it down, get that spread out a little bit and get it looking a little more even, going all the way to the edges of the base. Don't be precious, by the way, about going over the sides of the base. I know some people are sort of purists when it comes to that sort of thing. But I don't particularly mind a little bit of overhang. It actually makes the base look a little bit more organic to me. All right, we'll come back to that one in a second. This one is the super slushy one that we're going for. So I'm going to use lots more water here. Lots and lots of water. Really spread this out and thin it. I'm going to leave a little bit of a trail here, or at least I'm going to try to. Try not to get a whole lot of liquid across it, just to preserve a little bit of what might sort of be a hiking trail or a game trail, if I can sort of get the effect. We'll see. Do try when you're doing this thinner type of effect. You don't want to make it totally homogeneous. You want some areas to be more concentrated just for the contrast. So I'll leave most of this part alone once I've softened it down. So that's the slushy one. I think that's about done now. That'll dry out really nicely. But I want to come back to this one only because we've got these big stretches of mud. And what I'm going to do is, with the residual product left on the brush, I'm soaking that down a bit with a bit more water. And I'm just going to, separate to these blocks, I'm going to go in and fill those areas in. What that's going to do is let a little bit of the product still shine through under the coating layer. That ground will be looking frosty, but you'll still get that glistening of the mud coming through underneath. But those two bases done, we'll dry those up. I'll get the other two painted, and we'll come back when the snow is dry. Well, here we are a few hours later, and what we've got is 4 bases that are now pretty much dry. I think it's been about 3 hours since we applied our snow. The one that's maybe not fully dry is only this one, and it's because it has the thickest layer of product on it, but the outside is mostly dry, so it gives you a sense of the texture of the snow when it is actually fully dry. What I've done is I've arranged these 4 from most blended, most slushy, all the way through to the least blended, where I haven't really touched them. The reason that I wanted to show this was to give you a sense of just how the snow can be applied over the top of the wet ground. You remember this one was our most slushy. We were trying to have a bit of ice, a bit of melted snow approach that would let you maintain some of the shine of the wet earth below. And you can see, even though I've gone over the top and I've blended it a little bit more off camera, you can see the effect is still very much there. This is the other one that we did. This one was with the stony outcrops. We melted the snow in between the stones, and I think it looks really, really nice. It looks really quite natural, to be honest, with the snow forming around the rocky outcrops, and just with how it's blended down and starting to merge with the mud as well. Remember, we did put a little bit of product all over this area, but it was really light, and you can still see the wet ground reflecting that as well. It's not as strong as the natural wet ground, so this is the one without anything on it, but you can still see, plenty of that shine coming through. The next one, I tried to do a little bit of both, so a bit of a drift, again, to add some structure to this base. I really liked how the product has nicely melted between the 2 stones and sort of forms a little bridge. I'll probably carry on with a few more that have this similar structure as well. I really like it. And then finally, this is the snow with very little blending at all. The only blending that I've done has been over the top to round out any sharp edges, or those meringue style points, those soft peaks, but just to make it suit the sort of same aesthetic as the others. But I just wanted to show you this one again, just to give you an example of how this snow looks when you clump it up, when you make it into a bit of a drift, and the outcome of what happens when you don't do that more involved blending with water. This would work really nicely, I think, though, if you put it on a pathway. You've got the drifts that are being shoved to the side by your units that are moving through them. Maybe you could put some footprints through the mud and mix that up with the snow when it's still wet. But realistically, it's still not a bad one. It's just not quite fitting the aesthetic of the army that I'm going for. But that's it. Really simple, really easy approach. I think the only thing to add realistically on top of that to make sure it matches my the rest of my army would be some vegetation. I use the Army Painter Frozen Tufts to add a bit of texture on top of these. Some dead and frozen grass all the way through, make it sort of pop really nicely when they're lined up in combat order. But that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions at all about how to apply the products, where you can find them, let me know in the comments. Let me know also if you have some ideas about some things that you'd like us to visit from a hobby point of view. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.